In the courtroom, defendant Ethan Martinez treated the trial for his own son's murder like a private joke, his contemptuous laughter echoing off the chamber walls as his grieving wife testified against him. His smug facade, however, was built on a foundation of secrets he believed would never see the light of day. But that facade would shatter into a million pieces when the jury finally saw the text messages, revealing not just a cold-blooded killer, but a monster driven by a dark and twisted faith. The air in the small suburban home on Elm Street should have been filled with the scent of birthday cake and the joyful sounds of a child celebrating his 7th year of life. Instead, a chilling silence hung heavy in every room, a stark and unnatural void where laughter and light had once resided. Young Lucas Martinez had spent the entire week meticulously planning his superhero-themed party, laying out his favorite costume, and drafting a guest list with the serious focus only a soon-to-be 7-year-old could muster. His world was a kaleidoscope of vibrant colors, simple pleasures, and the unshakable belief that his parents were the twin pillars upon which his happy universe was built. That universe was about to be annihilated by one of the very pillars he trusted implicitly, his own father, Ethan Martinez. While Lucas's mother, Sophia, was out picking up the custom-made cake that was meant to be the centerpiece of the celebration, Ethan enacted a plan born from a grotesque and warped ideology. He saw not a son brimming with life and love, but a vessel for a dark entity that needed to be expunged in a ritual of profound violence. This monstrous conviction had been nurtured in the shadowy corners of an online group, a digital coven that had convinced him that his paternal duty was not to protect his child, but to purify him through a final horrific act. Ethan led his son, Lucas, down to the basement under the pretense of revealing a special birthday surprise, the boy's eyes wide with trusting excitement. The basement, once a playroom filled with toys and treasured drawings, had been stripped bare, transformed into a sterile and unnerving space. It was here that Ethan, with a calmness that defied all human decency, explained his horrifying new beliefs to his confused and frightened child. The act itself was swift, brutal, and executed with a chilling lack of hesitation, a father extinguishing the light of his own son based on a doctrine of madness he had adopted as his personal gospel. Sophia Martinez returned home less than an hour later, the brightly colored cake box held carefully in her hands, a smile on her face in anticipation of her son's delight. She called out Lucas's name, the cheerful sound dying in her throat, as she was met with an oppressive silence that was instantly, instinctively wrong. It was in the basement that her world ended, the sight before her so monstrously incomprehensible that her mind fractured, the joyful symbol of the birthday cake falling from her grasp to shatter on the floor. Her scream was a primal sound of absolute loss, a sound that would echo through the investigation and trial to come, the first testament to the innocence that had been so cruelly and senselessly destroyed. The initial responding officers found a scene of jarring and stomach-churning contrasts, the remnants of a planned birthday party juxtaposed with the grim reality of a homicide. Upstairs, colorful streamers and balloons hung limply in the air, a silent, mocking testament to the celebration that would never happen. Downstairs, investigators worked under harsh fluorescent lights, their faces grim as they documented the meticulous and disturbing nature of the scene Ethan had created. It was immediately clear that this was not a crime of passion or a tragic accident. It was a ritual, a calculated and deeply personal act of violence that spoke to a profoundly disturbed mind. The emotional toll on the first responders was palpable, many of them parents themselves who struggled to reconcile the evidence before them with a smiling school photograph of Lucas Martinez that sat on the living room mantel. They saw in his bright, innocent eyes the reflection of their own children, a realization that made the evil in that house feel suffocating and deeply personal. The entire neighborhood, a close-knit community where children played freely in front yards, was plunged into a state of shock and fear. The crime felt like a violation of a sacred trust, a tear in the very fabric of their peaceful existence, proving that unimaginable darkness could fester behind the most ordinary of suburban facades. For Sophia, the hours and days that followed were a blur of unimaginable pain, a waking nightmare from which there was no escape. Every corner of her home was a reminder of her loss, from the small, superhero-themed sneakers left by the front door to the half-finished drawing of their family still taped to the refrigerator. She was haunted by her son's laughter, a sound she could still hear in the silent house, a phantom echo of a life that had been stolen. Her grief was a physical weight, a crushing force that made it difficult to breathe, to think, to comprehend a world that no longer contained her beloved child. The investigation, meanwhile, began to focus on the one person who should have been a pillar of support for Sophia, her husband Ethan. His strange lack of emotion, his detached and almost clinical recitation of events, and his bizarre esoteric explanations for his son's death raised immediate and profound red flags for the seasoned detectives assigned to the case. They had seen grief in all its forms, from hysterical sorrow to quiet, stunned disbelief, but what they saw in Ethan Martinez was something else entirely. It was a chilling and unnerving void, an absence of the soul-crushing despair that any normal father would feel, replaced by an unnerving and righteous calm that was far more terrifying than any outburst of rage. The arrest of Ethan Martinez did not take place after a dramatic chase or a tense standoff. It occurred with a quiet and unsettling civility on his own front porch, 2 days after his son's murder. As the detectives approached, he showed no signs of surprise or fear, instead greeting them with a look of mild, almost condescending amusement, as if they were functionaries in a system he no longer recognized. When they informed him he was being placed under arrest for the murder of Lucas Martinez, he simply nodded, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. His complete lack of resistance was not a sign of resignation, but of a profound and unshakable arrogance, the quiet confidence of a man who believed he was operating on a plane of existence far beyond their mundane authority. Inside the stark, sterile environment of the interrogation room, Ethan's bizarre behavior only intensified, confirming the detectives' darkest suspicions about his psychological state. He refused the customary offer of water or coffee, instead sitting perfectly still, his hands resting calmly on the metal table, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond the one-way mirror. He exuded an aura of serene detachment, observing the proceedings with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying a lesser species. To the seasoned investigators, who were accustomed to a spectrum of reactions from denial to hysteria, Ethan's placid demeanor was one of the most disturbing things they had ever witnessed. When the lead detective began the questioning, Ethan interrupted him, not with a denial or a demand for a lawyer, but with a calm, infuriating lecture. He explained that the laws of the state and indeed the country were irrelevant to him, as they were constructs of a corrupt and fallen system that held no true authority. He spoke of a higher universal law and his allegiance to a council of light, a celestial body that had supposedly sanctioned his actions as a necessary energetic cleansing. His words were a torrent of nonsensical pseudo-spiritual jargon, delivered with the absolute conviction of a prophet sharing an undeniable truth with a world too ignorant to understand. This was not a confession in the traditional sense. It was a proclamation, a manifesto delivered with a chilling lack of emotion. He never once referred to Lucas by name, instead using dehumanizing terms like the vessel or the host entity, describing the murder not as an act of violence but as a transference of energy. He scoffed at the detective's attempts to appeal to his sense of paternal love or grief, dismissing such emotions as base-level attachments that he had transcended. His refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of their investigation was absolute, transforming the interrogation into a surreal and infuriating ordeal for the officers who found themselves arguing the fundamentals of reality with a man who had completely divorced himself from it. He repeatedly told them their badges and guns were illusions of power and that the only true judgment would come from a source they were incapable of comprehending. The detectives tried every tactic in their playbook, from presenting him with a photograph of his smiling son to describing the horrific details of the crime scene, but nothing could pierce his armor of self-righteous delusion. He looked at the photo of Lucas without a flicker of recognition or sadness, his expression remaining one of placid superiority. It became terrifyingly clear that he did not see himself as a monster, but as a martyr, a soldier in a cosmic war that only he and his anonymous online followers could perceive. This strange, pseudo-legal argument, a variant of sovereign citizen ideology filtered through a New Age cult lens, was his entire defense. He did not deny the act, but denied that it constituted a crime under any law that he deemed valid, an argument that was as insane as it was insulting to the memory of his murdered child. His every word was a testament to his profound narcissism and his complete and utter lack of remorse or empathy. The detectives realized they were not dealing with a man who had snapped under pressure, but with someone who had deliberately and methodically hollowed out their own humanity and replaced it with a monstrous and unyielding ideology. The performance continued for hours, with Ethan seeming to draw energy from the detective's growing frustration. He would often pause mid-sentence, a beatific smile on his face, and claim he was receiving guidance from his otherworldly masters, a theatrical display of piety that only highlighted his depravity. He seemed to relish the opportunity to preach his twisted gospel to a captive audience, treating the interrogation room not as a place of reckoning, but as a pulpit. The officers, bound by procedure, were forced to listen to his infuriating diatribes, all while the image of a 7-year-old boy, betrayed in the most horrific way imaginable, burned in their minds. When the interrogation finally concluded, with Ethan formally charged and led to a holding cell, he left the detectives with a final, chilling statement. He told them that they should be thanking him for the great service he had performed, and that one day they would understand the necessity of his actions. He was not a suspect begging for mercy or a liar trying to evade responsibility. He was a zealot utterly convinced of his own righteousness and completely detached from the horrific reality of his crime. The detectives were left with the sickening realization that the coming trial would not be a search for truth, but a battle against a form of madness so absolute it defied all reason. The key to unlocking the true depths of Ethan Martinez's depravity lay not in a hidden weapon or a secret witness, but within the cold, digital confines of his home office computer. Forensic investigators, executing a search warrant, meticulously combed through terabytes of data, searching for anything that could explain how a father could commit such an unthinkable act against his own child. What they discovered was far more chilling than a simple confession. It was a comprehensive and terrifying window into a mind that had been systematically poisoned by a dark ideology, a discovery that would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Buried deep within an encrypted folder protected by layers of security was a document titled The Lucian Mandate, a sprawling 172-page manifesto written by Ethan himself. It was a chaotic and disturbing blend of New Age spirituality, conspiracy theories, and a bespoke theology of cosmic warfare. The document was a diary, a philosophical treatise, and a murder plan all rolled into one, chronicling Ethan's awakening over the past 18 months. He wrote of his growing conviction that certain souls on Earth were demonic placeholders and that his son Lucas had been identified by the Council of Light as one of these entities. The manifesto was filled with passages of chilling pseudo-intellectual prose where Ethan described his own son in monstrous terms. He detailed a series of tests he had performed on Lucas' mundane childhood behaviors like tantrums or moments of defiance, which he had interpreted as proof of the entity's dark influence. He wrote with a sickening sense of self-pity, casting himself as a tragic, heroic figure, a spiritual warrior forced to make an impossible choice for the greater good of humanity. The document was a masterclass in narcissistic self-deception, the written record of a man meticulously constructing a reality in which he was the hero and his innocent child was the monster. More than just a diary of his descent into madness, the Lucian Mandate was a blueprint for murder. In the final chapters, Ethan detailed his plans for the purification ritual with a terrifying and methodical clarity. He outlined the steps he would take, the timing he would use, and the spiritual justifications for each horrific detail of the crime. He wrote about the need to perform the act on Lucas's 7th birthday, believing the date held a specific numerological significance that would maximize the energetic release. It was undeniable proof of premeditation, a cold, calculated plan that had been fantasized about, documented, and refined for months before it was carried out. The discovery of the manifesto was a devastating blow to Sofia Martinez, who was forced to confront the written evidence of her husband's monstrous transformation. She read passages where Ethan described her as a sleeping soul, too attached to the material illusion to understand the great cosmic importance of his mission. He wrote about her love for their son as a weakness, a barrier to the necessary act he had to perform. For Sofia, it was like reading the words of a stranger, a complete and horrifying inversion of the loving husband and father she thought she knew. The prosecution, led by the sharp and determined Amelia Harris, now had the central pillar of their case. The manifesto was a direct line into the mind of a killer, a self-authored indictment that laid bare both his motive and his meticulous planning. It utterly destroyed any potential defense strategy centered on insanity or a sudden psychotic break. Ethan Martinez was not a man who had lost his mind. He was a man who had deliberately and methodically replaced his conscience with a twisted ideology that sanctioned murder, and he had documented every step of that horrifying journey. This digital discovery also shed light on the shadowy online community that had served as Ethan's echo chamber. His browser history was a cesspool of obscure forums and encrypted chat groups dedicated to the same bizarre belief system. Investigators found posts where Ethan discussed his theories about his son with other anonymous users who encouraged and validated his insane conclusions. They praised his courage and his commitment to the path, creating a virtual environment where his monstrous delusions were not challenged but celebrated, a conspiracy of silence and encouragement that helped pave the way for Lucas's murder. The manifesto became the prosecution's roadmap, a document that would allow them to narrate the story of Ethan's descent into evil in his own words. It was a piece of evidence so powerful and so damning that it seemed to guarantee a conviction. Yet, for all its legal significance, the document was also a profound human tragedy. It was the story of a family destroyed from within by a poisonous ideology, a heartbreaking testament to the fact that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who believe, with every fiber of their being, that they are the heroes of their own story. In the months leading up to the trial, the legal proceedings were punctuated by Ethan Martinez's escalating displays of contempt for the very system that was holding him accountable. His behavior during pre-trial hearings became a source of constant frustration and outrage for everyone involved, most notably his own court-appointed defense attorney, a seasoned public defender named Robert Miller. Miller, tasked with the unenviable job of representing a man who had murdered his own child, found his efforts to mount any kind of coherent defense utterly sabotaged by his client's staggering arrogance and open hostility. Ethan treated his lawyer not as an advocate, but as an underling in a system he despised. During their private consultations, he would lecture Miller on the futility of man's law, dismissing legal strategy as the pathetic maneuvering of unenlightened minds. In the courtroom, during procedural hearings, his defiance was on full public display. He would openly laugh at Miller's advice, sometimes shaking his head with theatrical pity when his lawyer would raise an objection or file a motion. This behavior made it impossible for the defense team to function, as their client was actively working to undermine their every move. The most shocking of these displays occurred during a hearing to discuss the admissibility of Ethan's manifesto as evidence. As Robert Miller argued that the document was the product of a delusional mind and should be considered with caution, Ethan let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed through the quiet courtroom. He then turned to his lawyer and, in a stage whisper, loud enough for the entire prosecution table and the judge to hear, said, "You can't defend me because you don't even understand the nature of the war we are in." This open mockery of his own counsel was a stunning breach of decorum that left the courtroom in a state of shocked silence. This defiance of counsel was not just an act of petulance. It was a calculated performance designed to project an image of untouchable superiority. Ethan wanted everyone to see that he was above their petty rules and procedures, that he was a prisoner of a lesser system, not a participant in it. He refused to wear the suits his legal team provided, opting instead for the standard-issue jail jumpsuit, which he wore with the pride of a uniform. He saw his trial not as a legal battle to be won, but as a platform to be used, a stage from which he could broadcast his twisted worldview to a captive audience. His actions created an impossible ethical and strategic dilemma for Robert Miller. The defense attorney was bound by his professional duty to represent his client, but Ethan's behavior made it clear that he had no interest in being defended in any conventional sense. Miller's attempts to build a defense around diminished capacity or mental illness were met with scorn by Ethan, who insisted he was more sane and clear-headed than anyone else in the room. This left the defense with virtually no viable path forward, a reality that seemed to delight Ethan as it reinforced his narrative of being a lone martyr standing against a corrupt and ignorant world. The prosecution, led by Amelia Harris, watched these pre-trial antics with a mixture of professional focus and personal disgust. While Ethan's self-sabotage certainly made their job easier from a legal standpoint, it was also a constant and painful insult to the memory of Lucas Martinez. Every smirk, every whispered joke to his lawyer was another twist of the knife for Sophia, who attended every hearing, her face a stoic mask of grief. Harris found herself becoming fiercely protective of Sophia, her resolve hardening with each new display of Ethan's monstrous narcissism. The judge, a stern and experienced jurist named Carol Thompson, was forced to repeatedly admonish Ethan for his behavior. She warned him that his continued disruptions and his open contempt for his own legal counsel would have serious consequences. These warnings, however, had no effect on Ethan, who seemed to welcome the judge's rebukes as further proof of his own importance. He viewed every interaction as a clash of wills, a test of his spiritual strength against the fallen authority of the court, a test he was always convinced he was winning. This pattern of behavior established the central conflict of the coming trial long before the jury was even selected. It would not be a simple matter of guilt or innocence, as the evidence was overwhelming. Instead, it would be a confrontation between a system built on reason, evidence, and the rule of law, and a man who had completely rejected those principles in favor of a self-serving delusion. Ethan Martinez was making his own lawyer's job impossible, but in doing so, he was also revealing his true character to the world, that of a remorseless, arrogant, and utterly evil man. The trial of Ethan Martinez began on a cold morning in early October, the courtroom packed with press, members of the community, and the two families that had been shattered by the crime. A palpable tension filled the air, a heavy silence that was broken only by the shuffling of papers and the nervous coughs of the gallery. Ethan was led to the defendant's table, and as he sat, he scanned the room with a look of detached superiority, his eyes briefly locking with his wife, Sophia, before dismissing her with a faint, condescending smirk. He was a performer taking his place on stage, ready for the spotlight he so clearly craved. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Amelia Harris, who stood before the jury with a solemn and commanding presence. She began not with a horror of the crime, but with the brightness of the life that had been lost. She painted a vivid picture of Lucas Martinez, a happy, vibrant 7-year-old boy who loved superheroes and drawing pictures of his family. Her words were a poignant and heartbreaking tribute, designed to ensure that the jury saw the victim as a real person, not just a name on a legal document, before she delved into the darkness that had consumed him. The first witness called to the stand was Sophia Martinez. Dressed in simple, dark clothing, she walked to the witness box with a fragile but resolute dignity, her gaze fixed forward, deliberately avoiding any eye contact with her husband. Her voice was soft but steady as Amelia Harris gently guided her through the events of that horrific day, her testimony painting a devastating portrait of a mother's worst nightmare. She spoke of the excitement for the birthday party, the custom-made cake, and the chilling silence that greeted her when she returned home. It was during this raw and emotional testimony that Ethan's monstrous lack of empathy manifested in its most shocking form. As Sophia's voice broke while describing the moment she found her son's body, a sound rippled from the defendant's table. It was a short, sharp, incredulous laugh, a sound of pure contempt that cut through the somber atmosphere of the courtroom like a shard of glass. Every head snapped towards Ethan, who was leaning back in his chair, a cruel and mocking smile on his face, as if he were watching a piece of bad theater. The outburst was so sudden and so profoundly inappropriate that for a moment the entire courtroom was paralyzed in shocked silence. Sophia stopped speaking, her body tensing as the sound of her husband's laugh bored into her. Amelia Harris froze, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. Then, before the judge could even react, Ethan compounded his act of cruelty by shouting across the room, his voice dripping with venom, "Oh please, such a performance. You never understood what was at stake." The words were an assault, a deliberate act of psychological violence aimed at the grieving mother on the witness stand. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge slammed her gavel, her face livid with rage, demanding order as bailiffs moved towards the defendant's table. Sophia let out a choked sob, her carefully constructed composure finally shattering under the weight of her husband's vicious taunt. In the gallery, members of her family cried out in anger and grief. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated evil, a man laughing at the pain he had inflicted, a monster revealing his true nature for all to see. This infuriating outburst, happening on the very first day of the trial, irrevocably shaped the proceedings to come. It was no longer just about the evidence, it was about the man at the defendant's table, a man so consumed by his own narcissistic worldview that he was capable of laughing at his wife's testimony about the murder of their child. The jury, a panel of ordinary citizens, stared at Ethan with expressions of open horror and disgust. In that single, horrifying moment, he had likely done more to seal his own fate than any piece of evidence the prosecution could present. After the judge restored a semblance of order and the jury was temporarily removed, Ethan was given a blistering dressing down, but the damage was done. His act of contempt was not a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a calculated display of his core belief that he was superior to everyone in the room, especially his grieving wife. He felt no remorse, only a profound and arrogant disdain for the base-level attachments he had so proudly claimed to have transcended. This outburst was a window into his soul, and what the jury, the judge, and the world saw was a void, a cold, black, and utterly empty space where a human heart should have been. As the trial moved into its second week, the prosecution began to systematically dismantle any lingering doubt about Ethan Martinez's guilt, building a mountain of evidence that was as damning as it was heartbreaking. Amelia Harris presented a methodical and relentless case, introducing crime scene photographs, forensic reports, and the expert testimony of the medical examiner. But the most powerful evidence, the moment that would serve as the trial's pivotal turning point, came not from an expert witness or a piece of physical evidence, but from the cold, glowing screen of a projector displaying a series of text messages. These messages, recovered from Ethan's phone, were a conversation between him and another member of his secretive online group, a man known only by the username Veritas9. The texts were dated in the weeks and days leading up to the murder, and they provided a chilling, real-time chronicle of Ethan's intentions. The prosecution displayed them on a large screen for the jury to see, the casual, typewritten words standing in stark, horrifying contrast to the subject matter they discussed. It was here, in these digital whispers, that the full scope of Ethan's depravity and the conspiracy of silence that enabled him were laid bare. The first text message from Ethan read, "The council has confirmed the designation. The vessel is corrupted beyond repair. The purification is scheduled for his 7th solar return." Veritas9 responded moments later with a single, chilling message, "A difficult path, brother, but a necessary one for your ascension. We are all holding you in the light." The courtroom was utterly silent as the words hung in the air, a plain and simple acknowledgement of a murder plot, discussed with the mundane detachment of planning a business meeting. This was not the language of delusion. It was the language of conspiracy. As Harris advanced through the message log, the conversation became even more explicit and grotesque. Ethan bragged about his plan, describing how he would orchestrate the event to coincide with his wife Sophia being out of the house. He wrote, "The sleeper must not interfere with the work. Her emotional attachments are a liability to the mission." Veritas9 offered encouragement and advice, suggesting Ethan document the process for the archives, a sickening indication that this group treated such horrific acts as events to be studied and revered. The most damning exchange occurred on the morning of the murder. Ethan texted, "The work is to be done today. I feel a great sense of peace. The vessel's time in this dimension is over." Veritas9's reply was the final horrifying seal on the conspiracy. "May your hand be steady and your will be pure. You are doing a great service to the cosmos. He will be unmade, and you will be reborn." The text was sent just 2 hours before Lucas Martinez was killed, a final digital blessing for an act of unspeakable evil, a clear and undeniable proof that at least one other person knew about the murder plot and did absolutely nothing to stop it. As the jury read these messages, a wave of revulsion was visible on their faces. The text transformed the crime from the act of a lone, delusional man into a conspiracy, a murder that was not only premeditated but encouraged and validated by a hidden community. The friend, Veritas9, who could have made a simple, anonymous phone call to the police and saved a child's life, had instead chosen to be a cheerleader for a killer. The weight of that complicity, the casual evil of his inaction, was a secondary shockwave that radiated through the courtroom. Ethan Martinez watched the presentation of the texts with his customary smirk, but for the first time a flicker of something else, annoyance perhaps, or even a hint of concern, crossed his face. He had believed his digital communications were secure, that the sacred conversations of his enlightened circle were beyond the reach of the profane world. Seeing his own words, his proud proclamations of his murderous intent, displayed for the jury to see, was a violation of his sanctum, a moment where the fallen system he so despised demonstrated its power. It was the moment the trial's central theme, articulated in the media's clickbait headlines, came to life. The accused killer, who had laughed and treated the proceedings as a joke, was now forced to watch as the jury saw the texts. For Sophia, seeing the messages was another layer of unbearable torture. It was the ultimate betrayal, the realization that her husband had not just killed their son, but had discussed it, planned it, and bragged about it with a friend. The casual cruelty of his words, especially his dismissive references to her as the sleeper, was a devastating blow. The man she had loved, the father of her child, had been living a secret life so monstrous and so complete that it had erased everything she thought was real. The texts were not just evidence of a crime, they were the obituary for her entire life, the cold, hard proof that it had all been a lie. The defense's case was in a state of near total collapse before it even began, hamstrung by a mountain of incriminating evidence and an openly hostile client. Robert Miller, Ethan's beleaguered public defender, had only one desperate long-shot strategy left: to put Ethan Martinez on the stand. It was a move born of sheer desperation, a high-risk gamble that went against every instinct Miller had as a defense attorney. His hope was that, perhaps, the jury might see Ethan's bizarre beliefs as evidence of a profound mental illness, a flicker of sympathy that could potentially spare him the harshest possible sentence. Ethan, however, saw the decision to testify not as a legal strategy, but as a long-awaited opportunity. He had been waiting for this moment, the chance to take center stage and deliver his sermon to the world, to explain the grand cosmic significance of his actions to the unenlightened masses. He walked to the witness stand with the confident stride of a professor approaching a lectern, his expression one of serene and absolute self-assurance. He was not there to defend himself against a murder charge. He was there to convert the courtroom to his twisted faith. Under the gentle and leading questions of his own lawyer, Ethan was initially composed, laying out the core tenets of his bizarre ideology in a calm and articulate manner. He spoke of vibrational frequencies, soul contracts, and the interdimensional war between forces of light and darkness. He explained that his son, Lucas, had been infiltrated by a parasitic entity from a lower astral plane, and that his actions were not murder, but a soul liberation. It was a performance of breathtaking arrogance, a man calmly and rationally explaining why killing his child was a noble and heroic act. The moment Amelia Harris, the prosecutor, rose for her cross-examination, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Harris was not interested in debating cosmic theology. She was there to expose a monster. She approached the witness stand with a quiet, focused intensity, her questions precise and relentless, each one designed to peel back the layers of Ethan's self-serving narrative and reveal the ugly, narcissistic core beneath. The ensuing confrontation would not only destroy the defense's case, but would also provide the trial's most riveting and horrifying moments of drama. Harris began simply, holding up a large, glossy photograph of Lucas, a school picture showing a smiling, gap-toothed 7-year-old boy. "Mr. Martinez," she asked, her voice deceptively soft, "is this the parasitic entities you liberated?" Ethan glanced at the photo with dismissive contempt. "That is merely the vessel," he replied coolly. "The physical shell, its sentimental value, is an illusion." His clinical, dehumanizing language, spoken while looking at a beautiful photograph of his own dead son, sent a visible chill through the jury box. The cross-examination was a masterclass in controlled demolition. Harris relentlessly hammered Ethan on the inconsistencies and conveniences of his beliefs. She asked why the Council of Light only communicated with him through anonymous internet forums. She asked why a cosmic cleansing happened to look identical to a brutal first-degree murder. With each question, Ethan's calm facade began to crack, his serene professorial demeanor giving way to flashes of irritation and anger. He was not accustomed to being challenged, and he grew visibly frustrated with Harris's refusal to engage with him on his own theological terms. The breaking point came when Harris brought up the text messages, projecting them once again on the large screen for everyone to see. She read aloud his boastful message to Veritas 9. "The work is to be done today. I feel a great sense of peace." Then she turned to him, her voice ringing with cold fury. "Mr. Martinez, was this great sense of peace you felt the same peace a father feels on his son's birthday, or was it the peace of a predator who has finally cornered his prey?" The question hit its mark. Ethan's face contorted in a snarl of rage, his mask of enlightened superiority finally crumbling to reveal the snarling monster beneath. "You are incapable of understanding," he spat, his voice rising to a shout. "You are a slave to the material world. You mock what you cannot comprehend." It was a tirade, a torrent of self-pity and wounded pride. He had expected to be feared, or perhaps even revered, for his spiritual wisdom. Instead, this woman was reducing his grand cosmic narrative to the sordid, pathetic motive of a common killer. His staggering arrogance, which had been his shield throughout the trial, now became his undoing. The cross-examination continued in this vein, with Ethan becoming increasingly unhinged, his answers growing more belligerent and his rants more grandiose. He inadvertently admitted to key details of the crime, his ego driving him to correct the prosecutor on minor points, thereby demonstrating his intimate knowledge of the murder. Robert Miller sat at the defense table with his head in his hands, watching his client single-handedly and enthusiastically destroy his own case. The gamble had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. Putting Ethan on the stand had not revealed a flicker of insanity, but a blinding, undeniable glare of pure narcissistic evil. The final phase of the trial before closing arguments was the presentation of victim impact statements, a moment for the court to hear not about the crime, but about its devastating and permanent consequences. It is a solemn and often heart-wrenching part of any trial, but in this case it would be punctuated by an act of such profound and monstrous cruelty that it would leave an indelible scar on everyone who witnessed it. Sofia Martinez, who had already endured the unimaginable torment of testifying against her husband, returned to the courtroom to speak one last time, not as a witness, but as a mother. She did not take the witness stand this time, but stood at a lectern facing the judge, her voice trembling but clear. She spoke not of the murder itself, but of the vibrant, beautiful life that had been extinguished. She shared small, intimate memories of Lucas, his infectious giggle, his obsession with building elaborate forts out of couch cushions, the way he would hold her hand so tightly when they crossed the street. Her words painted a portrait of a beloved child, a universe of joy and potential that had been reduced to a collection of painful memories. Her statement was a testament to a mother's unending love and a cry of pure, undiluted grief. "He was my world," she said, her voice cracking with emotion as tears streamed down her face. "Ethan didn't just take my son. He took my future. He took my past. He took every sunrise and every breath I will ever take from now on, and he poisoned them with the memory of what he did." The courtroom was steeped in a heavy, sorrowful silence, with several jurors and even some hardened court reporters seen wiping away tears. It was a moment of raw, unbearable human pain. It was at the peak of this emotional crescendo, as Sofia spoke of the stolen future and the empty room in her house, that Ethan Martinez committed his final and most unforgivable act of courtroom terrorism. From the defense table, a single, sharp sound cut through the silence. It was a laugh. Not a nervous chuckle or a derisive snort, but a genuine, short, sharp laugh of what sounded like pure amusement. The sound was so shocking, so completely out of place, that a collective gasp swept through the gallery. Every eye in the room, including Sofia's, swiveled to face Ethan. He was leaning back in his chair, his head slightly cocked, with a look of bored, clinical detachment on his face. He made no attempt to hide his reaction. He had heard his wife's raw anguish, her testament to a life destroyed by his actions, and it had amused him. It was a psychological vivisection, a man looking down at the pain he had caused with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. The laughter was the breaking point. It was the final, irrefutable proof of his monstrosity, an act so far beyond the pale of human decency that it seemed to defy comprehension. The judge, her face a thunderous mask of fury, slammed her gavel down with such force that it cracked. "Mr. Martinez," she roared, her voice shaking with rage, "you will be silent, or I will have you bound and gagged for the remainder of these proceedings. Have you no soul?" But Ethan simply looked at her, his faint smirk returning, as if her outrage was just another amusing, predictable reaction from an inferior mind. This moment of laughter was more damning than the manifesto, more incriminating than the text messages, and more horrifying than the crime scene photos. It was a confession not of the act, but of the soul. In that single, abhorrent sound, Ethan Martinez told the jury everything they needed to know about him. He was not just a killer, he was a being entirely devoid of empathy, a man who could listen to a mother's heartbreaking and find it funny. It was an act of pure, unadulterated evil, a moment that would haunt everyone in that courtroom for the rest of their lives. For Sophia, the laugh was a final, brutal severing of any lingering connection to the man she had once loved. It was as if he had reached across the courtroom and struck her, a final act of abuse that was purely psychological but devastatingly real. She stood, frozen at the lectern, the rest of her statement dying in her throat. There was nothing more to say. His laughter had said it all, providing a horrifying and unforgettable exclamation point to her testimony of unimaginable loss. Just as it seemed the trial could hold no more shocks, the prosecution called a final surprise rebuttal witness, a man whose existence had been unknown to the defense and the public until that very moment. His name was Daniel Scott, a pale, nervous-looking man in his late 20s who had been a member of the same secret online group as Ethan Martinez. Fearing for his own legal exposure after Ethan's arrest and plagued by a guilty conscience, Daniel had come forward to the district attorney's office just days earlier, offering to tell the full story of the dark ideology that had led to the murder of a 7-year-old boy. Daniel Scott's testimony was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle, a revelation that contextualized Ethan's monstrous actions within a framework of organized, systematic evil. He explained that their group, which called itself the Archons of the Final Dawn, was not just a collection of passive believers, but a structured and hierarchical cult. At its head was a charismatic and manipulative leader known only as Prometheus, who issued directives and identified targets for purification. The group believed they were elite spiritual soldiers in a war to cleanse the earth of demonic entities inhabiting human bodies. Under Amelia Harris's careful questioning, Daniel revealed the cult's most sinister secret: membership and advancement within the group's inner circle were not based on study or devotion, but on action. To prove one's loyalty and ascend to a higher level of enlightenment, a member was required to perform a great work, which meant carrying out a purification ritual on a designated target. These targets were often the most vulnerable people imaginable: children, the elderly, or the disabled, as the cult believed demonic entities were drawn to hosts who lacked a strong, defended spiritual aura. The courtroom listened in stunned horror as Daniel explained that Lucas Martinez had been designated as a target by Prometheus himself. Ethan, eager to prove his worth and climb the ranks of the cult, had volunteered for the assignment. The murder of his son, Daniel testified, was not just an idea Ethan had concocted from his own madness. It was a required act of violence, a horrifying initiation rite he had to complete to gain status and acceptance within this secret society of monsters. This revelation cast the crime in an even more sinister light, transforming it from a personal delusion into a cult-sanctioned execution. Daniel's testimony provided the context for the text messages, explaining that Veritas9, the user who had encouraged Ethan, was another high-ranking member of the cult. He described a system where members were conditioned to see their horrific acts as noble sacrifices, their lack of empathy celebrated as a sign of spiritual evolution. He read from the cult's internal documents, which he had provided to the prosecution, detailing their twisted theology and the cold, bureaucratic language they used to describe acts of murder. It was a glimpse into a hidden world of profound evil operating just beneath the surface of normal society. The most chilling part of his testimony came when he described Ethan's ambition within the group. According to Daniel, Ethan wasn't just a follower, he wanted to become a leader. He saw the murder of his own son as a stepping stone, a grand gesture that would prove his unwavering commitment to their cause and position him as a potential successor to Prometheus. His crime was not just an act of faith, it was an act of brutal sociopathic ambition, a father sacrificing his child on the altar of his own ego and his desire for power within a depraved fantasy world. Ethan Martinez, for the first time in the entire trial, looked genuinely shaken. Daniel Scott's betrayal was something he had clearly never anticipated. The secrets of the archons of the final dawn, the sacred truths he believed made him superior, were being laid bare for the unenlightened world to see, spoken by a man he had once considered a brother in arms. His carefully constructed reality, the one in which he was a heroic warrior, was being exposed for what it was, a pathetic and evil little club for murderers who cloaked their sadism in the language of spirituality. Daniel Scott's testimony was the final horrifying twist, the revelation that the evil was bigger than just one man. It painted a picture of a network of individuals hidden behind anonymous usernames who were actively encouraging and directing people like Ethan to commit unspeakable acts. The murder of Lucas Martinez was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a much larger sickness. The final revelation was not just that Ethan was a monster, but that he belonged to a cult of them, and they were still out there, hiding in the digital shadows, waiting for their next victim. The jury's deliberation was remarkably swift, lasting a mere 45 minutes. When they filed back into the jury box, their faces were grim and resolute, and they refused to look at the defendant. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, but its formal announcement still sent a wave of quiet relief through the gallery. Guilty on all counts, first-degree murder, with the special circumstance of lying in wait. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, but the final sentencing hearing, held 1 week later, would provide the trial's ultimate moment of catharsis and condemnation. On the day of sentencing, Judge Carol Thompson, who had maintained a stoic and impartial demeanor throughout the trial, finally set aside the mantle of judicial restraint. After allowing Sofia Martinez to give one final brief statement about the life sentence of grief she had been given, the judge turned her attention to Ethan. Her eyes, which had for weeks been a model of neutrality, now burned with a cold, righteous fury. She was no longer just an arbiter of the law. She was the voice of a society that had been profoundly violated by this man's actions. "Mr. Martinez," she began, her voice low and laced with steel, "for the past several weeks, this court has been forced to listen to you, cloak your unadulterated evil in the language of spirituality and cosmic importance. You have built a cathedral of self-serving nonsense to house your own monstrous ego, and you have explained away the murder of your own beautiful, innocent child as a great work. Let me be clear, so that no one in this room, or anyone who hears of this case, is under any misapprehension. You are not a warrior. You are not a martyr. You are a narcissistic, pathetic, and soulless coward." The judge's words were a blistering and methodical demolition of Ethan's entire worldview. She was not merely sentencing a man, she was passing judgment on his ideology, stripping it of its pseudo-intellectual pretensions and exposing it as the ugly, pathetic excuse for murder that it was. "You speak of a higher law," she continued, her voice rising with each word. "There is no law, human or divine, in any universe that would sanction a father murdering his 7-year-old son on his birthday. That is not the law of the cosmos. That is the law of the abomination. It is the creed of the monster." Ethan Martinez sat at the defense table, his smug facade finally beginning to crumble under the sheer weight of the judge's condemnation. His face, which had been a mask of arrogant detachment, was now pale and slack-jawed. He had been able to withstand the legal arguments of the prosecutor and the tears of his wife, but this direct, personal, and authoritative evisceration of his very soul seemed to be the one thing that could pierce his armor. He was being seen, truly seen, not as the enlightened being he imagined himself to be, but as the worthless and evil thing he truly was. Judge Thompson's speech reached a crescendo of righteous fury. "You took a life filled with promise and light, the life of your own son Lucas, and you extinguished it to satisfy your own pathetic desire to feel important within a cult of sadists. You laughed in the face of his mother's grief. You have shown this court a level of depravity that is truly, genuinely shocking. You are a cancer on the human race, a void in human form, and it is the solemn duty of this court to ensure that you are excised from society permanently so that you can never again poison the world with your presence." With that, she delivered the sentence, her voice ringing with finality. "Ethan Martinez, for the murder of Lucas Martinez, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will spend every remaining day of your natural life in a cage, and that is a mercy you do not deserve. My only regret is that the law does not allow me to do more." She slammed her gavel down one last time, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. As the bailiffs moved in to lead him away, Ethan Martinez, the self-proclaimed warrior of light, looked small, defeated, and utterly, irrevocably broken. Justice had not just been served, it had been delivered with a righteous fury that honored the memory of the little boy whose life had been so cruelly stolen.